Hey, a suicide note found more than 60 miles from where it was written. A horrifying secret buried for 5 years, frozen in time inside a chest freezer. And the person keeping that freezer? A court official, a man who spent his days inside a courthouse, upholding the law. When the truth finally came out, people couldn't believe it, because it turned out every single member of that family had been pulled into this thing. Every one of them. Our story starts in Shiga Prefecture, right in the dead center of Japan's main island, Honshu. And at the heart of Shiga is Lake Biwa, one of the most iconic landmarks in the entire country. This lake is enormous. We're talking about a body of water so massive it takes up 1/6 of the whole prefecture. Because of that, most of Shiga's towns and cities have built up around its shores, clustering close to that water. On the eastern side of Lake Biwa sits Nagahama City, a key transportation hub in one of the most important cities in the region. Nagahama is known for its scenery, its deep historical roots, and its well-preserved cultural heritage. But more than anything, its geography, tucked between mountains and water, gave it a kind of self-contained, closed-off character, almost like a world unto itself, cut off from everything around it. So let's jump ahead to 2007, in a quiet residential area of Nagahama called Yotutsuka. That's where a family by the name of Iwase moved into a rental home. 3 people, but not your typical setup. No husband, wife, and kid. Instead, it was 3 generations under one roof. An elderly grandmother, a 54-year-old father, and a 31-year-old son. At first, the neighbors didn't think much of them. But as the weeks went on, the Iwase family became something nobody could quite figure out. They cut themselves off completely. No community involvement. Barely a hello to the people next door. The doors stayed shut. The windows stayed shut. It was like an invisible wall had gone up around that house, sealing the 3 of them off from the rest of the world. But eventually, a few of the more attentive neighbors started picking up on things that didn't quite add up. The morning of April 2nd, 2025, a Wednesday, a thin mist hung over Nagahama, and the air still carried that sharp, cold bite of early spring. In the Yotsutsuka neighborhood, the Iwase house looked exactly the same as it always did. Doors shut, windows shut, not a sound. Then, right around 8 a.m., 49-year-old Iwase Tatsuhiko stepped outside, wheeling his bicycle onto the street. He had on a clean suit, polished shoes, looked like any other guy heading into the office. And in a way, he was. Tatsuhiko worked as a clerk at the local courthouse, a respectable position, the kind of job that demands precision, discretion, and a steady hand. But beyond his daily commute, neighbors almost never saw him. He climbed onto that bike and, just like he had done every single day for over a decade, disappeared around the corner right on schedule. Back inside that dim, quiet house, his 72-year-old father Koichiro was still home. After the grandmother died, it had just been the 2 of them, father and son, getting by together. And in all the years since, aside from a handful of relatives who'd stopped by to pay their respects at the grandmother's wake, not a single guest had come through that door. The Iwase home had been sealed off from the outside world for years. But that morning, the quiet shattered. Without any warning, a police cruiser rolled slowly down the street and stopped, right in front of the Iwase house. Neighbors who happened to be passing by instinctively slowed their steps, heads turned, eyes locked on the scene as several officers climbed out and knocked on that tightly closed front door. A few minutes later, a stretcher rolled out, covered with a blue sheet. Right behind it, Koichiro emerged, head down, mask on, and was guided into the back of the police car. At the same time, across town, officers located Tatsuhiko at work. That day, he never made it home at his usual hour. So what had happened? Who was under that blue sheet? Here was a man who worked in the justice system. Could he really have broken the very laws he helped enforce? Whispers started spreading through the neighborhood almost instantly, rumors multiplying street by street. But nobody, not a single person standing there that morning, knew that the whole thing had actually started more than 60 miles away in Osaka. So what exactly went down? To understand it, we need to go back to the night before. Let's rewind to the previous evening and shift our focus completely, away from Nagahama, heading southwest, about an hour and a half by car, and you land in Osaka Prefecture. Near the center of Osaka sits an older city called Sakai. It's a major industrial and residential area in the Kansai region, densely populated, lived in, the kind of place where people have deep roots. More specifically, we're talking about a neighborhood called Fukacho and Naka Ward, Sakai City. It's one of those older, quieter residential pockets tucked inside the city. The kind of place where neighbors actually know each other, where people wave when they pass on the street. Usually, nothing happens here. It's that calm. But on the evening of April 1st, after everyone had come home and settled in for the night, police got a call. On the other end of the line was a middle-aged man, and he was panicked. He said he'd just gotten home from work and found his elderly parents collapsed on the floor, not moving. Officers rushed to the scene. The household was a simple family of three: a 51-year-old husband, a 71-year-old wife, and their adult son, who had made the call. The son led officers to where his parents were, a storage room inside the house. Both of them were slumped on the floor. But here's the thing. The scene was completely undisturbed. No signs of a struggle, no forced entry, nothing out of place. The windows were even locked from the inside. Police got them to the hospital as fast as they could. It was too late. Both had already passed. The son was devastated. He couldn't wrap his head around why his parents would have made that choice. But as investigators started going through the scene, they found a letter sitting out in plain sight, and the moment they read it, the entire mood in that room shifted. Most of the letter wasn't what grabbed their attention. It was two specific sentences. They read, "We hear there's something noteworthy in Nagahama, Shiga Prefecture that hasn't been dealt with. Nagahama, Shiga Prefecture, Yotsutsuka-cho, Iwase Koichiro residence." The officers exchanged looks. This wasn't vague. This wasn't emotional. This was specific, deliberately, chillingly specific. Osaka investigators got on the phone with the Shiga Prefectural Police that same night. The very next morning, April 2nd, Shiga Prefectural Police moved fast. They showed up at the address named in that letter and conducted a full search of the Ewood family's home. And then, in the corner of the main house, they found it, a large chest freezer, and sitting right beside it, air fresheners, strategically placed. When officers slowly lifted the lid, a wave of cold air rolled out. Inside was the body of a woman, middle-aged, still dressed in everyday clothing. She had been dead for years. Her body had been preserved, sealed in time, to the point where an immediate autopsy wasn't even possible. Identifying her cause of death and who she actually was going to take time. With that discovery, both Iwase Koichiro and his son Tatsuhiko were taken into custody, and investigators started working multiple angles at once. Who was this woman? What did the dead couple back in Osaka have to do with the Iwase family? To even begin answering those questions, police had to start with the father and son themselves. They went out and interviewed neighbors, relatives, anyone who knew them, and what they kept hearing over and over was the same thing. Yeah, these two kept to themselves, but they seemed like decent people, gentle, honest, not the type. Which somehow made all of this even harder to process. To the people around him, 72-year-old Iwase Koichiro was just a quiet old man living out his days. But looking back at his life, it was a story of one setback after another. Koichiro had actually grown up in Nagahama. After high school, he packed up and headed to Osaka to build something for himself, got into telecommunications, got married, had a son named Ren. For a while, it probably looked like things were going to work out, but they didn't. He never talked about the specifics, and his relatives could only speculate. Maybe the collapse of Japan's economic bubble had gutted his career. Maybe things just fell apart. Whatever the reason, his wife eventually divorced him, and Koichiro, broke and out of options, packed up his son and moved back to his hometown, back to Nagahama. Once he got there, he inherited the family's ancestral property, about 660 square meters. In that area, that kind of land meant something. It was a sign of standing. And his son Rin managed to land a stable job at the local courthouse, which seemed like a solid foundation to rebuild on. But stability never really came. For reasons nobody could fully explain, Koichiro kept falling deeper into debt. By 2007, things had gotten bad enough that he was forced to put the ancestral home up as collateral just to borrow 5.6 million yen, roughly $36,000 at the time. And eventually, even that wasn't enough. He sold everything, the land, the property, all of it. And with his elderly mother and his son in tow, he moved into a cheap rental house. Neighbors who knew him from around the neighborhood described Koichiro as a friendly enough guy. He didn't go out much, but if he ran into you on the street, he'd give you a nod, offer a greeting. When word got around that he'd sold the ancestral home, people talked. But since coming back to Nagahama, Koichiro had always kept his relatives at arm's length. So even the ones who had questions didn't feel like it was their place to ask. Then, about 5 years before everything came crashing down, Koichiro's mother passed away. The family didn't have money for anything elaborate, so they held a simple funeral at home. After she was gone, Koichiro, a man who had never liked going out, started making regular trips to visit her grave. To his relatives, that meant something. It painted a picture of a man who truly valued family, who cared deeply. Which is exactly why, when all of this came to light, most of them refused to believe Koichiro was the one behind it. Their theory was that the son, Tatsuhiko, must have done something wrong, and the father was just covering for him. But the neighbors who lived right next door had a completely different read on Ren. To them, he came across as even more withdrawn than his father, barely spoke. And look, he was a court clerk. That's not exactly a profession that attracts troublemakers. Nobody around there had ever seen the man smile, not once, not even a hint of optimism on his face, ever. And honestly, his behavior was even stranger than his personality. On days off, Tatsuhiko almost never left his room. The curtains were always pulled shut, like he was hiding from the daylight itself. On top of that, even though he and his father lived on the same property, they might as well have been living in different worlds. The Iwase property had two structures, a main house and a separate annex with its own entrance. Tatsuhiko lived exclusively in that annex, which is a strange setup for a man pushing 50, a government employee, to be living in a back annex like that. Every day when he got home from work, he didn't go into the main house, didn't sit down with his father for a meal, didn't rest under the same roof. He went straight into that annex and closed the door. It was genuinely bizarre. And when you sit with that detail, the father and son living on the same property but in completely separate buildings, something darker starts to take shape. Because if that freezer was always kept inside the father's main house and the two men clearly weren't close, then you have to ask yourself, was it really possible that the son, holed up in that annex every single night, had no idea what was sitting just a few feet away? There was one piece of neighbor testimony that stuck out above everything else. For a stretch of time, one neighbor said they heard shouting coming from the Iwase house almost every single evening. A younger voice, almost certainly Rin, going at it with his father. This went on for over a month. It got so bad, so relentless, that the neighbor finally couldn't take it anymore and went over to say something. But the moment that door opened, both men completely transformed. They stood there at the entrance, trembling, not saying a word, faces full of what looked like shame. The neighbor left thoroughly confused, and after that, the shouting stopped. That wasn't the only strange thing about that house, though, not even close. The Iwase father and son were essentially ghosts to the people around them. No community events, no neighborhood gatherings, nothing. There's a traditional system in Japanese neighborhoods where a rotating notice board gets passed from house to house so everyone stays informed. When it reached the Iwase home, it just stopped. They never passed it along. Eventually, the neighbors stopped expecting them to. The unspoken agreement became, just skip their house, finish the round, and slip the notice into their mailbox on the way back, like junk mail. And in the winters, Nagahama gets hit hard with snow. The Iwase men never once shoveled. Neighbors would just quietly do it for them, clearing their doorstep without being asked because the house always looked so cold and abandoned. Over the span of an entire decade, neighbors only ever saw 3 outsiders come to that house. It happened around 5 years prior, right after the Awase grandmother passed away. First, an unfamiliar couple, somewhere in their 50s or 60s, showed up saying they were there to help sort through the deceased's belongings. They stayed a day or two and left in a hurry. Then, shortly after, a man in his 30s or 40s showed up, jeans, driving a car that looked out of place in that neighborhood. He didn't come across as a friend of Ren's. Everything about him, his body language, the way he moved, carried this strange, hard-to-pin-down awkwardness, like someone who didn't want to be seen. And not long after those 3 mysterious visitors came and went, something shifted inside the Awase household, noticeably. Suddenly, they seemed to have money. The landlord was the first to notice. In the early years of the rental, the Iwase family was chronically late on rent. It was just a given. But shortly after those 3 people showed up, the payments started coming in on time. Every month, no issues. The neighborhood association noticed it too. Around there, annual membership fees were the norm. Everyone paid once a year. But the Awase family had worked out a special arrangement given their financial situation. They were allowed to pay monthly instead, and even then, they'd still occasionally fall behind. But then, out of nowhere, Kuchiro walked up to one of the community staff members and said, "I've been causing trouble for everyone all these years. I'm finally able to pay the annual fee like everybody else." And from that point, right up until the day everything unraveled, he did exactly that. Paid in full, every year, no reminders needed. The neighborhood gossip started up immediately. People whispered about whether the family had come into some kind of dirty money. A few people floated a more innocent theory. Maybe with the grandmother gone, one less mouth to feed had eased things up enough. But police pushed back on that pretty quickly. Given how deep in the hole the Iwase family had been, losing one dependent was the difference between drowning and barely treading water. It couldn't explain a turnaround this dramatic. Years of chronic late payments suddenly replaced by clean, on-time annual fees. Something else had changed, and the most likely explanation was those 3 visitors. Here's where it starts clicking into place. Think back to the beginning of this story. The elderly couple in Osaka who left the letter, and the son who made the emergency call. 3 people, 1 family. Factor in the timeline, and a few years back, that couple would have been right around 50 to 60 years old. Their son would have been in his 30s. Those ages line up almost perfectly with the 3 strangers who showed up at the Iwase house. So was that a coincidence? Or were those visitors the Osaka family, coming to Nagahama to make some kind of arrangement with the Iwase father and son? The theory that started forming was this. That family had handed off the problem of the woman in the freezer to the Awase men. And in exchange, money changed hands, enough to quietly turn the Awase family's finances around. But that still left the biggest question unanswered. Who was the woman in the freezer? And what exactly was her connection to the couple who died in Osaka? To figure that out, investigators turned their attention back to Osaka Prefecture. And in Sakai City, the layers of a years-long tragedy involving 3 separate families slowly began to peel back. Let's talk about the couple who died. We'll refer to the wife as Ms. A. Now, one detail worth noting, Ms. A was actually 20 years older than her husband. And the letter that blew this whole thing open, she wrote it. Their neighborhood, much like Nagahama, was the kind of tight-knit community where people paid attention, where routines got noticed. And in the days leading up to their deaths, a few neighbors picked up on the fact that something was off. Normally, Ms. A's husband would pull into the driveway around 10 p.m. after work, regular as clockwork. But about a week before the incident, that routine broke. One morning, a neighbor coming home happened to glance over and saw that car already parked nearby. Inside the garage, 3 people were huddled together, 2 men and a woman, heads down, expressions serious, documents spread out in front of them like they were working through something complicated. One of the men was younger, wearing a white hoodie. By the look of them, they could have been a family, but the neighbor only caught a quick glimpse and couldn't say for certain. Then, the Friday before it all happened, someone spotted an unfamiliar blue car sitting in a nearby public parking lot. A man behind the wheel, just waiting. A little while later, Miss A and her husband came out of their house. The witness said Miss A didn't look well. She was unsteady on her feet, and her husband had to support her as he helped her into the passenger seat. Then he got in too. The blue car drove away with all three of them inside. Investigators initially worked from the theory that the woman in the freezer was somehow connected to Ms. A and her husband, and the more testimony came in, the stronger that theory got. The working hypothesis was this: Ms. A had been paying the Awase family. That's what had turned their finances around. But over time, the amount being demanded kept climbing, a blackmail spiral. And when Ms. A refused to keep paying, the threat of exposure hung over her head. That would explain the tense meetings, the serious faces, the documents spread across the garage floor, people trying to figure a way out of an impossible situation. But no agreement was reached, and knowing that, Ms. A made a decision. She wrote the letter. She exposed everything herself, on her own terms, ending the blackmail by detonating the secret before anyone else could use it against her. Police also flagged the fact that Koichiro had lived in Osaka during his earlier years. Could he have known Ms. A's family from back then? That question sent investigators digging into Ms. A's background, and what they found was a family connection so close, so tangled, that even the police hadn't seen it coming. It turned out that Koichiro hadn't just known Ms. A's family from his time in Osaka. He had been her brother-in-law. Back when Koichiro was at the peak of his career, he'd built a life in Osaka. Job, apartment, family. He married a woman from the Nonaka family. She was the eldest of 3 siblings. Below her was a younger sister, and below that, a younger brother. And that younger sister, the middle child, was Ms. A. At the time, all 3 Nonaka siblings had put down roots in Osaka. The eldest had married Koichiro. Ms. A, the middle sister, was also married. And the youngest brother, Nonaka Hideki, had married a woman named Mariko. For a while, all 3 households were in each other's lives constantly. Neighbors would see them coming and going from each other's homes on a regular basis. By all appearances, they were a close, warm, extended family. But then, a few years back, something changed. Mariko, the youngest brother's wife, vanished, just disappeared. When relatives and friends tried asking about her, everyone dodged the question. Some people said she'd gone back to her hometown. Others said she'd run away. And over time, the subject just faded. Nobody brought it up anymore. It was as if Mariko had simply been erased from the picture entirely. But here's the thing. Based on her age alone, Nonaka Mariko was a dead match for the description of the woman found in that freezer. And when the forensic results came back, it was confirmed. DNA testing identified the body as Nonaka Mariko, missing for several years and now found. With the victim identified, the last piece of the puzzle snapped into place. Mariko's husband, Nonaka Hideki, the youngest sibling, wasn't going to be able to walk away from this. Police tracked him down in Osaka. He was 63 years old, working part-time as a cleaner in Higashi Ward. When they sat him down and laid out the evidence, he didn't fight it. He admitted it. The woman in the freezer was his wife. But even with that confirmation, the fog around these 3 families didn't lift. It thickened. Because if Mariko had simply died of natural causes, why would anyone go to the trouble of transporting her body across multiple prefectures and hiding her inside a freezer at an ex-brother-in-law's rental house? That wasn't the behavior of people with nothing to hide. Something much darker was underneath all of this. Before we go any further, let's take a step back and lay out the key players, because there are quite a few of them, and keeping track matters. There are 6 people across 3 families, and once you see how they connect, everything that follows hits a lot harder. The first family is the Iwase household, the one with the freezer. Koichiro is the father, the man who came back to Nagahama broke and beaten down, eventually renting that house in Yotsutsuka. His son is Iwase Tatsuhiko, the courthouse clerk with the shuttered curtains and the annex he never left. Koichiro had been married into the Nonaka family, but that marriage ended in divorce, and he and his son eventually cut ties with Osaka. Yet somehow, for reasons that weren't immediately clear, the Iwase men had stayed connected to the other two families. The second family is Miss A and her husband, the couple found dead in Sakai City, Osaka. Miss A is the middle Nonaka sibling. She's the one who wrote the letter, and as investigators would come to learn, she knew everything, every last detail. The third family is where the tragedy actually began. The youngest Nonaka sibling, Nonaka Hideki, is the part-time cleaner who was the last to be arrested. And his wife, Nonaka Mariko, is the woman in the freezer. Even though Koichiro is technically an ex-brother-in-law at this point, we'll keep referring to him that way just to make things easier to follow. On the surface, the story seems straightforward enough. Mariko dies, and through Ms. A's family acting as a go-between, the Iwase men are brought in to help hide the body. But once Koichiro, his son Ren, and Hideki started talking after their arrests, a much older and much uglier truth began crawling out from underneath. Remember how the story mentioned that the Iwase family's finances seemed to suddenly improve about 5 years back? Neighbors assumed they'd come into some kind of windfall. And yes, it was connected to Mariko's death, but the explanation was the exact opposite of what anyone would have guessed. The Iwase family hadn't gained money. They had simply stopped losing it. A massive, ongoing drain on their finances had finally stopped, and that drain had a name. That drain was Miss A, the middle sister, and it had been bleeding them dry for decades. According to Ren's testimony, he and his father had been sending money to Ms. A for over 20 years, not occasionally, consistently. The total, by the time it was all added up, came to nearly 100 million yen, roughly $640,000 at today's exchange rates. To scrape together that kind of money over the years, Koichiro had done everything short of selling his own organs. He'd borrowed from anyone who would lend to him. He'd traveled around chasing down funds. He'd sold the ancestral land, the property, all of it. Half of his pension, gone, straight into Ms. A's pocket. Ren's salary was almost entirely handed over, month after month, year after year. That's why they ended up in that rental house. That's why they couldn't make rent. That's why the membership fees were always late. They weren't just poor, they were being systematically drained, and Tatsuhiko had resented his father for it, deeply, for years. But it wasn't just the Iwase family. Ms. A's own biological younger brother, Hideki, was caught in the exact same trap. Whatever he made working part-time, it went to her, almost all of it. And that's when the truly chilling picture started coming into focus. Miss A wasn't just a difficult family member. She was the one in control, the puppet master behind all of it. How exactly she maintained that level of control over two separate families, the Iwase men never fully explained, and neither did Hideki. But what was clear was this: Nonaka Mariko had crossed her. After marrying into the family, Mariko had never been comfortable with the way Ms. A operated. She didn't fall in line. And at some point, during a family gathering, she said so out loud. She voiced her doubts, openly, in front of everyone. That was the moment everything turned. Ms. A didn't take it as criticism. She took it as a challenge to her authority, and she responded by ordering punishment. She told Hideki, Mariko's own husband, to hurt his wife. And when Hideki hesitated, Ms. A turned the threat around. She told him that if he didn't comply, she'd send her nephew Ren to come after him instead. Ren was physically imposing, and Hideki knew it. Eventually, under that pressure, he broke. During interrogation, Hideki admitted that he started going along with it just to protect himself. He also insisted that he kept the violence minimal, a light tap on the head, a gentle pat on the back, things that barely registered. But Miss A wasn't satisfied. She kept pushing. Under her direction, it escalated. The attacks became more frequent, more severe, and Mariko's health began to fail. At that point, Hideki was living at home with his elderly mother, and the house had caregivers rotating in and out on a regular basis. That created a problem. With that many eyes coming and going, Ms. A needed somewhere private, somewhere no one would ask questions. And right around that time, the Iwase family's grandmother passed away, leaving Koichiro and his son as the only two people in that house in Nagahama. Quiet, isolated, off the radar. To Ms. A, that was an opportunity. So she made the call. Mariko was to be moved to Nagahama to stay at the Iwase house. And suddenly, a lot of things that had never made sense started clicking into place. The curtains that were always drawn. The reason Ren, every single day after work, went straight into the annex instead of stepping foot in the main house. That habit hadn't come from nowhere. It had started during that period, when a woman was being kept inside those walls, suffering. He knew what was happening in there, and he wanted as much distance from it as he could get without physically leaving. The annex was his way of pretending it wasn't real. But whatever small hope remained that things might turn around inside that house, it didn't last. Mariko's condition kept declining, and not long after she was brought to Nagahama, she died. That's when those three mysterious visitors showed up. The older couple and the younger man that neighbors had spotted entering and exiting the Iwase house. The most likely explanation, looking back, is that the older couple was Ms. A and Hideki, coming to Nagahama to figure out what to do with the body. The timing lines up. It was right around when the Iwase grandmother had also just passed. As for the younger person in the group, investigators were never able to pin down definitively whether it was Ms. A's son or someone else who'd come by to pay respects. That detail stayed unresolved. What did come out during Hideki's interrogation was how the decision was made. Everyone in that room agreed this could not come to light. The freezer idea came from Hideki himself, and Ms. A signed off on it. He went to a supermarket, bought the freezer, brought it to the Iwase house, and together they put Mariko inside. After that, contact between the families dropped off significantly, and with Ms. A no longer demanding payments, the Iwase family's financial situation quietly improved. But don't mistake that for relief, because the Iwase father and son didn't feel better. If anything, they felt worse. The weight of what was sitting in that main house pressed down on them every single day, and those shouting matches the neighbors used to hear late at night, now they made complete sense. Tatsuhiko worked in a courthouse. He sat inside that building every single day, surrounded by the law, processing cases, watching justice move through its paces. He understood better than anyone in that family exactly what they had done and exactly what it meant. And yet, every morning he put on that suit, got on that bicycle, and rode to work like everything was fine. He maintained the appearance of a perfectly normal, functioning member of society. But the moment he came home, he couldn't bring himself to walk through the door of the main house, not once. He'd go straight to the annex, lock himself in, and stay there. It was the only way he could cope, by physically refusing to face what was on the other side of that wall. Because for Tatsuhiko, that main house wasn't a home anymore, it was a mortuary. And his father Koichiro was deteriorating too, just in a different way. The secret was aging him from the inside out. Tatsuhiko couldn't stand it, couldn't stand his father's passivity, couldn't stand the feeling that everything could collapse at any moment with no warning. The pressure had been building for years with nowhere to go, and the only outlet he had was those arguments, screaming at his father in the middle of the night just to release some fraction of what was eating him alive. Meanwhile, to keep the smell contained, the two men kept every door and every window in that house sealed shut, year-round, no exceptions. And about 6 months before police finally showed up, they added deodorizers next to the freezer, a last-ditch attempt to hold the secret together just a little longer. It didn't work. By the time officers lifted that freezer lid, Mariko had been in there for 4.5 years. As the investigation went deeper, police put forward a theory about Ms. A's death that was somehow even colder than anything that had come before it. The letter she left, the one that exposed everything, may not have come from a place of guilt or regret. investigators believed it came from spite, pure, calculated spite. Because here's what had been happening in the months before she died. The Iwase family and Hideki had been quietly pulling away from her, using the weight of what they'd all done together as a reason to create distance, to stop taking her calls, to shut her out. They wanted to bury the past and just live. And Ms. A, who was over 70 at that point, sick, physically unsteady, running out of time, felt it happening. The woman who had controlled everything, who had dictated the actions of two entire families for decades, was being abandoned, and that enraged her in a way that nothing else could. So she made one final move. If she couldn't hold her reign, she would burn it all down on her way out. She wrote that letter knowing exactly what it would set in motion. She wanted Tatsuhiko, her own nephew, the courthouse clerk, stripped of his job and his reputation. She wanted Hideki hauled into a courtroom, and she wanted Koichiro, the man who had kept her secret locked in a freezer for years, to die in prison. As the full picture of the case came together, it exploded online. People couldn't stop talking about it. Because what had happened here, one woman operating from the shadows, bending three families to her will, turning them against each other, making them complicit in something unforgivable, reminded a lot of people of a name from Japan's criminal history, Sumida Miyoko. Sumida was a notorious offender who was active in the latter half of the last century. She moved through different regions, worming her way into families and then systematically dismantling them from the inside, using manipulation, division, and fear to make family members turn on each other, sometimes violently. The parallels to Ms. A were hard to ignore. Same playbook, same darkness, just a different era. But unlike Sumida, who had faced justice, Miss A had already left this world. The law had no reach over her anymore, which left one question hanging in the air. What would happen to the three men she'd left behind? It didn't take long before Koichiro, Tatsuhiko, and Hideki were all formally indicted on charges of aiding in the concealment of a body. And then came the waiting. Eventually, the case went to trial at the Otsu District Court in Shiga Prefecture. In the courtroom, prosecutors laid out their argument clearly. Yes, none of the three men had set out to put Mariko in that situation, but they were grown adults who had made choices. For years, they had neither pushed back against Ms. A nor gone to the authorities on their own. That silence, that complicity, had consequences. The defense pushed back, arguing that since none of the three were the architects of what happened, their culpability deserved to be weighed differently. And then the defense attorney asked Hideki directly about his feelings for his wife, and Hideki broke down. This man who had spent years crushed under Ms. A's thumb, who had turned his hands against the woman he was supposed to protect, he finally cracked open. He said he hadn't been able to protect her, that she had suffered things she never should have had to suffer, that he was deeply, genuinely sorry. It was the most human moment in the entire case, and it changed nothing about what he had done. After deliberation, the court handed down its verdicts. Nanaka Hideki, guilty. 1 year in prison, suspended for 3 years. Iwase Koichiro and his son Iwase Tatsuhiko, guilty. 10 months in prison, suspended for 3 years. The court's reasoning was clear on both counts. Hideki, as Mariko's husband, had failed her in the most fundamental way possible. He hadn't just stood by, he had actively participated in harming her, then handed her over to the Iwase men, then proposed hiding her body, and then walked away and never looked back. That level of disregard for a human life, for his own wife's life, warranted punishment. As for the Iwase father and son, they hadn't been in the room when the worst of it happened. But for 4 to 5 years, they had actively maintained that secret, kept those walls sealed, kept those air fresheners stocked, and made sure no one ever found out. That was not a passive role. The court acknowledged that all three had clean records and had expressed genuine remorse, and so it showed leniency, but it did not look away. Through every word of the verdict, the three men who had lived so long under Ms. A's shadow stood there in silence. The case is closed, the verdicts have been delivered, but what lingers, what really stays with you after all of it, isn't the legal outcome. It's the relationship at the center of all this, the twisted, suffocating web that one woman wove around 3 families and pulled tight over the course of decades. Because these were people who were supposed to love each other, siblings, in-laws, a husband and wife. The kinds of bonds that are supposed to be a refuge, a safe place to land when everything else goes wrong. Instead, under Ms. A's hand, those bonds became the weapon. Every connection, every tie, every obligation turned into a chain. And when you step back and look at what actually happened here, it's almost hard to comprehend. A husband was ordered to hurt his own wife, and he did it. A son watched his father drain every asset the family had year after year and could do nothing but rage at him in the dark. An ex-brother-in-law became the keeper of a body he never asked to have and a house he could barely afford on a property he never truly felt safe on. Every single one of them was a victim of something deeply corrupt, and every single one of them was also an accomplice. Both things are true at the same time, and that's what makes this so hard to sit with. The verdicts have been read, the sentences handed down. On paper, they've paid their debt. But can Tatsuhiko ever walk past a freezer without feeling it? Can Hideki ever think about Mariko without hearing the things he said and did to her? Can Kochiro spend a single quiet evening without the weight of those 4.5 years pressing down on him? Maybe the courtroom wasn't their real punishment. Maybe the real sentence is the one they carry inside, in the memories, in the guilt, in the silence of a house that was never really a home. This case is a reminder of something deeply unsettling, that sometimes the worst things that happen to people don't come from strangers. They don't come from violence in the street or crimes in the dark. Sometimes they come from inside the family, from the dinner table, from the people who are supposed to know you best and protect you hardest. And sometimes breaking free from that kind of shadow costs everything you have. Every last bit of it, and then some. That's where we'll leave it today. We'll see you in the next one.